Hi, Carolyn. Can you share with us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to become a poet?
I would love to. First of all, though, I would like to thank the Friendswood Library for inviting me to be part of this video log and your arcade. I'm very honored by that request, so thank you very much. As far as thinking about my poetry career, I have to say immediately that I came to poetry later in life. Now, there was a moment when I was a child, I don't know what age, but I read this poem by Eugene Field, and it was called The Little Blue Boy. And I was so taken with that poem because it made me sob. And I thought, what kind of a form, what kind of words can make me cry when I don't want to cry? I wasn't a child that cried easily, you know? So I was so taken with that, and I was so passionate about what I was hearing, and what I was encountering basically was the power of language, the power of words, and the power of poetry. But I don't know why as a child, I never thought that people wrote poetry or that I could write poetry. I don't know if I thought it came from the gods or what. It never occurred to me that I could write it. So I sort of set aside that passion. And I went into my next career because it was discovered that I could sing. And I became a professional singer very early in life, working in musical theater. And I just kind of did that for 10 years. And then I switched to art, which I still am an artist. I'm a writer and an artist together. But I worked in those. But the interesting part of it is, when I look back on my career, was that I've been a journal keeper my whole life. And I have been writing, working with words. And what I call a journal is kind of like playing the piano scales of language. And so I was working with language, but once again, I wasn't thinking career. I was thinking just, I have to write. And I love the process of just the pen going across the paper. It's very physical for me. It's a very beautiful, satisfying thing of writing in journals. And I think that that journal writing, and I have boxes of them now that I'm wondering, like, what am I going to do with all these journals? But that journal writing kept alive that passion for writing. But there was a definite moment when I turned to poetry after these other careers. And I had just finished my third art book. And I don't know if I exhausted my writing group or what, but they broke up. And I was asking a friend, is there another writers group you know of that I could join? And she said, oh yeah, why don't you come to this poetry one? I said, oh no, I don't write poetry. I don't know the first thing about writing poetry. And she said, it doesn't matter. Come anyhow, you will really like the people in this. And I did. I love the people. But what was more important was that I reconnected to that passion that for language that had been ignited when I was, maybe 8 years old. So I marked that as the beginning of my writing poetry career.
Wow. And you mentioned, so you sang and you journaled and you're a visual artist. So I feel like for some, poetry can be a cerebral thing, but for you, it's material and cerebral because of, you mentioned the sensation of the pen across the page, and then singing. That, to me, that implies rhythm and movement, and I'm sure you capture that in your work as well.
I think you're right. And I have been told by people that I sing in my poems, that they're very musical. And they feel that I took that career, even though I'm not singing anymore, that I sing internally as I write. And I think that may be true because I'm very conscious of the rhythm, and I'll say a line over and over and I'll go, no, that just isn't right. It isn't the right sound. And I think also the art is very much a part of my poetry too, because I'm very visual. I start my poems often with some kind of an image, and I think of my poems as visual based on image, and then I move away from that. So I think that artist's eye and the singer's rhythm are still in the poems.
And you mentioned something, the first poem that you read that brought you to tears. I've wondered where it happens in a poem because I've been brought to tears by a poem, and I'm like, does it happen in just one line? Is it a good line that hits me? Is it a stanza that hits me? Where in it can I like localize this emotional burst?
Yeah, that's a very good thought. And I've kind of analyzed that too. But you know what I think, Drew, is I think that there's a building of momentum. I think there's a stacking of lines that little by little is working on your emotion. And then somewhere along there, there will be one line that really brings it home. But I think that it's very cleverly done. You know, like he says something about, well, the toys were new and the child played with them. And one night an angel came, but now the toys are covered with dust. This little boy blew it, you know, pretty soon. You're sobbing because he has this accumulative effect that is very, very interesting. And even though these days, of course, it's a child's poem, it would be considered a sentimental poem. But that's what's so interesting, that how can even these sentimental poems that we maybe negate a bit bring us to sobbing tears? That is extreme power in a poet.
Yeah, it makes me think of in Plato's Republic how he treats poets with a fearful respect, and that they can sort of manipulate the emotions of the society, and it could steer them wrong. So poets do have power, and
yes,
we need to remember that.
I like that, manipulate. That's exactly, I think, what a poet does, because you are molding it and you're trying to bring a reader who is possibly quite disinterested in your topic, but you are trying to mold them and interest them into what you have to say, to show them your insights and to bring them, in a sense, the same conclusion, or to make them think about their own conclusion, either direction. But you are working them in a very kind of subtle, manipulative way. So that's a good word.
So can you share with us a little about the Houston area poetry community and your involvement with specific groups or writers?
There are so many things in the Houston region that you can participate in as a poet. And I have been in many critique groups. I've been in poetry book salons. I've done readings. I've done the Houston Poetry Fest. Just everything that was available, I tried to involve myself with, because I think the community is very important, and we stimulate each other, we help each other, we support each other. But there was one to call out that I think was very instrumental and important in Houston, and that was the Mutabilis Press, that published anthologies of regional and Houston poets. And I call them a community poet publisher. And by that, I mean that they publish excellent poets who are in the general community, but not enrolled in a creative writing department or academic, something like that. And what they had that I thought was so interesting, because I served on the board for 10 years, is that the board members were actually the people who received the submissions, read through all of them, maybe 400, 600 poems, and then we would rate them. Then we would carry it all the way through to the conclusion, you know, choosing the cover, proofing, marketing, all these kinds of things. And one thing that I would say, if you're interested in writing, anyone who's listening to this, is try to get yourself to be a juror or to hear the jurying process. Because one thing I discovered, which helped develop me a lot, was that after I was jurying all these things, I noticed there were certain things that always bumped out a poet. You know, I would look at it and it would be kind of like, oop, already, you know, people are saying no. So you learn a great deal that way. But besides that, and the fact that the board members were all very, and that I enjoyed working with them for those years and producing a book. It's a pretty exciting thing when you start with just pieces of paper or submittable submissions, and suddenly you are holding this book and it was done by all of you. Well, I just think it's the most exciting thing. But what I think was really important, going back to the poetry community, is that this publication, because we don't have many in Houston presses, this publication really nourished the community. It excited the community. They had a place to submit their poems. And also, I know for sure that there were many people who are good poets now who have gone on to publish, who had their first poem printed in that anthology. So it was a really vital, wonderful press.
Excellent. And I'm thinking of The Enchantment of the Ordinary, which was the one Dr. Gorman oversaw. And yeah, it was quite spectacular.
That title, isn't it? The minute he said that title in the board, we just went, oh yes. Perfect titles. Enchantment of the Ordinary. I mean, that's an enchantment in itself, isn't it? It's like a haiku. Yeah, it was perfect.
So do you have a favorite poet or poets?
Well, I have a lot of them through the years. They come and they go, and usually I will seek one because of some need I have, and then I will totally devour that person's work and immerse myself into their rhythms, their topics, their everything that makes them that poet I would with. Right now, my favorite poet is Claudia Emerson, and she was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2006. And I'm totally immersed in her books because she writes a lot about the topic that I'm working on in my large manuscript, which is the topic of grief and sorrow when you're losing your family, farm, or home, or things that are disappearing. So when I'm looking at a book to be a favorite poet, I kind of have three things that I'm looking for. And the first one is that I want to find out how this poet navigates that topic. In other words, how does Claudia Emerson think about grief and loss that might be different from me? I want to get into her mind, and not because I want to copy any lines or that I want to cover the same kind of material, but because reading her is like brainstorming. She makes me understand other ways that I could approach that topic. The second thing that's really important to me is that I find so often reading a poet, they spur my memories. They uncover my memories. For instance, Claudia might talk about a barn. Now she's talking about a barn in a way that I've never seen that kind of barn. I've never had that kind of experience with a barn on my grandparents' farm. But all of a sudden, what she's saying brings me to a memory that had been buried really deep. So her words can lift some of my memories. And the third thing, and perhaps I would say that this is the most important thing, and I think people read for this reason all the time, because we hear this in a lot of writers' interviews, and that is that by reading their work, I want to write. I read their lines and suddenly I want to respond. There's something that energizes me because that work is touching me, the deepest core of my creativity. And so she's energizing that desire, and suddenly she's sending me back to my words to work on my own thoughts. So those are the three things that I look at, and I have been exploring Miss Emerson for a while now. So I'm kind of coming to the end of her books because she died very early. She was 57 years old. So I'm coming to the end, unfortunately.
Oh. So you're just talking about Claudia Emerson and your reaction to her work. It makes me think that poetry is not just merely fiction. There's some sort of deep psychological introspection that's happening when you read poetry, when you write it. it's more than, it's hard to explain, but it like you said, tapping into the memories. You would read a poem and it would sort of uncover buried memories or older memories or something you haven't thought about. And it's exciting to me sometimes to think of poetry as this sort of deep introspective vessel which we can delve into our psyches.
Well, and I think you're right again that it is a type of a vessel. It holds things, but also poetry does something that fiction doesn't. It leaps around. And
Mm.
that's why when people read it, they have to leap with the author. But you don't fill in all the details. The form is too small. Whereas I notice, like when I write fiction or nonfiction, I'm kind of going much more logically and I'm filling in all the details. But when I write poetry and I have to be in a certain mood, it has to sort of leap from one thing to the next. And I don't even know why it leapt there. Much more mystical than if I'm writing nonfiction or prose.
Yeah, you make me think about, I believe it was Robert Bly. He wrote Leaping Poetry, and talked about that leap and how it sort of disappeared and then reemerged with the modernist movement. And that's, yeah, I love that about poetry in general, that it takes these creative leaps into the unknown and connects things you would normally never connect.
You're absolutely right. You're right. And you're not even prepared for the fact that you're going to connect them. You don't think there's any connection in the world. And then all of a sudden the writing shows you, my gosh, they're totally connected. And you have this enlightenment, the eureka moment, like, oh yeah, how could I have missed that?
That's definitely a reason to write, is to just feel that eureka moment and connect,
Yes,
make that
definitely.
connection.
And yes, that's the pleasure, isn't it? Because there's a lot of things on the other side, the work, the hours, the loneliness, the trying to get it published, which is so difficult. That is all the hard work, the labor, but it's that process, being with the words and having those leaps. That's why we keep doing it. We keep being reinforced with the pleasure of writing poetry.
Can you give us a little background on your latest book and what was the inspiration for it?
Okay, my latest book, and I'm going to show you a cover of it. It's called A Muddy Kind of Love, and it has this wonderful toad on it. It's a chapbook, and if any of you don't know what a chapbook is, it's really a small poetry book, like at 5 to 40 pages, as opposed to a full manuscript might be 80 to 100. And it was the winner of the Poetry of the Plains and Prairies contest. And this was sponsored by North Dakota State University. So that's the backstory and how the book came about. But the personal story is that I have been working for quite a few years on what I call the family manuscript about the disappearing things that I'm seeing in my family and in our culture also. So when I saw this contest, I thought, I'm going to pull some of the most pertinent poems from this book, the full manuscript, and reorganize them into a chapbook. So I did that, and I have two sections. One is the female voice and one is the male voice, so that they can talk back and forth. And then we go from kind of time periods, like when they were young to middle to older. And so that's my organization for it. But I also felt that this was a North Dakota publisher, and I grew up in Minnesota. Many of the poems are set in a Minnesota environment, although because it's a rural landscape, it could be anywhere. It could be a farm in Texas too. It doesn't matter where it is because it's the same kind of philosophy. But I thought that maybe a North Dakota publisher would have a greater affinity for understanding where I'm coming from in the poems, in the work, because we are neighboring states, if you know your geography. And so we have a very similar culture and a very similar kind of land and raising things. So I thought that that would be good. So I did enter it. And I was one of the 11 finalists. And I kept telling myself, no, don't hope, don't work, no, just stay calm now so you won't be disappointed. But I won. And I think that my publisher heard me scream all the way from Texas to North Dakota when that message came in that I had won. So I was pretty excited by it. And the other reason why probably goes back to the fact that I'm also an artist is that part of the award was that the book would be handmade. It would be published on an old-fashioned turn of the century letterpress printing, and it would be numbered and it would be signed. And so it would be like a little collector's book. Mm-hmm. And I really love the fact that when you look at it, you can see the little variations in the print from someone who actually was printing it on the press. So that was another reason why it was very important to me, because I once found a little chapbook of Lorca poems, and I have it in my collection. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's a dream of mine, to one day have a chapbook that's letterpress, printed, handmade. So my dream made it. And I want all of you, when you check it out of the library, to just take a moment and just feel the book as an art object. Feel how beautiful the paper is, how smooth, how look at the print, that very inky. And if I may be so bold as to suggest, because I still do this, inhale in the book and see if you can smell the old-fashioned real ink, because that's the way books were all made before. And I love it that when you get a new book that's letterpress printed and you can smell it. I tend to think of it, and I suppose this is strange, but I tend to think of when this ink is kind of coming up from the page, that it's almost like my words breathing off the page, coming toward you to be inhaled. It's kind of special to me. So take a moment when you take it out of the Friendswood Library and feel that.
You can't do that with a Kindle or a Nook, can you?
You really could not. You really could not. I suppose I should tell you what it's kind of about also. Now that, like I said, it's kind of about the grief and the love of things that are disappearing in the rural community, the philosophy, the way of treating animals, the land. But I realized that I had no ability when our family farm was sold to stop development, to stop the future. But I did think I can preserve it in poems. I can make the poems an archive. So when anybody opens the book, you will be able to go back as a reader to the time period I'm talking about, people, the philosophy, the animals. So it will be really, you can revisit that time period. And that's what I wanted. And the book title, A Muddy Kind of Love. It's interesting because I worked on this title, and the line is actually in the poem Subtraction when you read the book. But I wanted something that implied complex, not sweet, romantic, but a complex kind of love. In other words, how do you define the love that a farmer has for its soil? Enough that he would take a pinch of the soil, roll it in his mouth to taste it. How do you define love with an animal that you have lived with your whole life, that has helped you and now is old and ailing? You know, what kind of love is that? And I wanted muddy in the title because I wanted there to be a sense of soil, because working with the very planet that we live on. So, but inside, as far as what's in it, you'll find all kinds of topics. I mean, there's a girl who wants to join a circus. There's a panther in the fields. There's a love letter that's really an airplane. And there's also one on a divining rod. And I'll tell you just a little backstory on this one, Drew. When my grandparents came to Minnesota, my grandfather came with a trunk of gold because he wanted to buy land. Well, he decided that he would bury it so no one would find it. And he didn't tell anyone, not even his wife. It was his big secret. And so consequently, you know what happened. He got dementia. And pretty soon, no one knows where this trunk of gold is. Now, somewhere on those hundreds of acres that have been sold, there is a trunk of gold that some developer or some happy family is going to find. So that's kind of, I use that family story in that poem. So, you know, this child in the poem spends his life trying to find this trunk. So it's kind of fun. But that is one time where it really did come from my life.
Wow.
I know, you want to get a shovel and head to Minnesota, right?
Yeah, I didn't know there was a treasure tale in there.
There is a treasure, hunting a treasure, you know, you all, and no one can figure out what the secret is, you know, everyone's trying to figure out, well, would it be by 2 trees? Was it by the family poppy field? You know, everyone's trying to speculate it. I grew up with that kind of speculation by everyone.
Would you be so kind as to share some of your poems from A Muddy Kind of Love?
I'd love to, Drew. The first one is from the first section where it's the female voices that I told you the book was divided into 2 sections. And this is when the person is very young. And like most young girls, they dream about the exotic life and running off to join the circus. So that's what this one's about. The weight of illusions. 8 elephants, bodies painted dazzled pink, raised trunks, shriek past the clown's monkey who covers its ears as they charge into the lighted ring. Pink animals could be a mirage, a freak of elephants, part terror, part fascination. Or a magician's trick of distortion. Any color is possible in circus light. But what illusionist conjures tiny women riding massive heads, waving glittered arms, feathered skirts rising, falling like pink wings in the running beast's breath? A farm girl in the waterfall of stands wants more than the repetition of prairies, so she waves wildly as if asking if she too could live outside the ordinary. She wants to be a princess of danger, fly with acrobatic angels, marry a man who eats fire, sleep under the wrinkled ear of a pink elephant. She would slit the seam of this moment, insert herself, let the circus grow over her. But the plumed women no longer wave, as if the invitation had been her misinterpretation. The elephants circle faster. Pink sweat drips down legs, a trail the girl could follow if the big tent wasn't already coming down, and the circus disappearing on the road, heading toward the next small town and another young girl's dreams.
It's lovely.
Thank you. And then I'm going to switch over to one with the male voices. And the woman's was when she was young, but this time we're going to when the man is older after he's had a full life as a farmer. And because it's set mainly in the Midwest, of course, there has to be a poem about snow. Only if you stare at snow. On mornings when the light believes it is a shatter of broken mirrors, a winter white weasel climbs the ice crust of a snowdrift packed against the picture window and looks at the old man who sits in his chair next to the stove every day. The man stares back at the animal's eyes, which reveal nothing a man could interpret as caring, and wonders what a weasel would want of him. except as a perplexity, a confusion in its known words, a man who never moves. Unsure of either's intent or what kind of connection could be made, the weasel scurries away on clicking feet, a sound the man cannot hear, only remember, as he must remember now everything he can no longer do. Noonlight arrives over the house in clear verticality. It carries no slant, no shadows to twin the black branches of trees rising from the snow like hairbrushes. Tolerant of afflictions, it hides color, lets it fall away into itself, the way noon shadows merge with what they will later reveal and release. Late afternoon, when light believes in angles and the snowdrift dense with blue shadows, the white weasel returns. The man is still there in his chair by the stove. The weasel comes all winter until the snowdrift melts and its fur turns spring brown. Brown as the cane across the man's knees, brown as the fields he no longer plows. Maybe it sits under the window all summer, waiting with its tiny curiosity, its weasel heartbeat of missing. Maybe it desires snow to lift its body to the window again, to see the man in his chair, waiting for something that will never come. Though this weasel has, for some reason, offering its tiny tracks in snow, a delicate newness in a world the man thought would never change. And then the very last poem in the book, which is really kind of sums up the book in a way because it talks about the loss and the loss of land that perhaps you have lived on your whole life and perhaps where you were born. It's called The Lost Field. Dig into the land, go below your life, put a hand through the dust of a rabbit with a bullet for a heart, a finger into the tunnels of earthworms moving the planet through their bellies. Wake the sleeping cicadas dreaming of buzzing in their underground rooms. Touch the brown ash of last year's wheat. Or maybe stars. Falling stars must land somewhere. Why not the open face of your field? Lick your dusty lips. Is this the taste of stars? Find a glass jar. With a silver spoon, fill it with soil. Watch it sparkle, dark glitter of outer space. Carry the jar with you always. No one owns a field of stars forever.
Wow. I'm speechless. That's quite beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful interview. And everyone, do purchase a copy of A Muddy Kind of Love or come to the library and check one out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Drew. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Enjoyed talking with you, and hopefully we can get you back on.